The legend of the fall is a narrative, a superstition, a myth within the Korean StarCraft brood war scene. So obviously we're talking primarily about the 2000s here, that a Protoss player, obviously the three races in StarCraft, Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, that a Protoss player would win the OSL, the On-GameNet Star League, the most prestigious individual league, 3 of them held per year. He would win the one that was held in or around the fall. And this happened many times in history. It famously began in terms of when people chart the history back, although at the time this same mystique didn't build up because, stories about how we reinterpret the past in many ways, unless you use them in a raw mythological sense to impart wisdom and some sort of cultural knowledge. So it began technically with Garimto, the Protoss player, winning the Sky 2001 OSL over Boxer. And I think, first of all, this highlights an interesting component of Koreans and their culture and how their general popular culture and historical culture has seeped into how they view esports and the lens through which they interpret things that have happened and patterns. Because Koreans are quite superstitious in a very specific way. I mean, people might have heard the famous story, which I can absolutely tell you is true, that a number of Koreans to this day still think that if you sleep in a room with a fan going around, an electric fan, that you can die of suffocation because somehow it reduces the oxygen supply or it chops oxygen particles in half or something bizarre like that. It basically stems supposedly from an urban legend that might have been spread by the government to make people use air conditioning less during some particular period. I believe it was in the 70s. Now, you can meet a lot of Koreans who are ashamed of this, or youngsters who've had a lot of contact with the internet and with the West who will say, oh, this is nonsense, it doesn't happen. I've met a number of Koreans who either thought that themselves before they had contact with the West or the internet, or if they're older, who still believe that to this day and have tried to explain to me some sort of really dodgy, almost bro science level understanding of why you would in fact die if you were in such a room. Even though I've told them, by the way, I've slept in rooms like this and it didn't cause any problems at all, and it's entirely a myth and we have no data to support it. But one of the good parts about their superstition is that they really do, in a way that Westerners don't, they continue to mythologize, to create a mystique around certain things that have happened, and they build these myths up in a way that is quite beautiful because it does impart something special or create a narrative that ties together otherwise disparate elements to say something about what happened and what can happen. And so the Legend of the Fall is one of my favorites, because the reason why it's significant is because for most of the history of StarCraft Brood War, the Protoss race has been the most hard done by of the three races. Now, funnily enough, at the beginning of the game's history, it was Terran that was the most hard done by, but the arrival of Boxer, innovating so much of the game, showing us the power of the dropship, showing us certain aspects of Marine Micro, actually put him on top, and then all of a sudden, ever since then, basically, Terrans have always been in a very good place, not least because their mirror matchup, TVT, was much more winnable and manageable, and less of a coin flip than especially ZVZ, but PvP also could be quite a build order mismatch in a way that TVT wasn't as traditionally. And so Terrans have always thrived in the OSL and in many of the individual leagues and have had a fantastic run, and some of the greatest players primarily are Terrans. Obviously we had Nada after that and I Love Uv, and then we had, well, obviously Flash and Fantasy. Now, Zerg had its beats in the early days. For the first few years, basically until Savior came along and was very, very good, they weren't winning big championships. They had their problems primarily because Terran got on top, and Terran always had its advantage in TVZ over the Zergs. And so while Zergs could bash on Protoss to some degree, they couldn't really win the championships except for that one-off where Go Rush won against Nada. And I don't really count that, quite frankly, as like Zerg being on top. It was very brief. And then he had July come along, but he won through insane balls, timing, mechanical advantages that other people couldn't replicate. So it wasn't really until Savior that Zerg kind of legitimately emerged. And then we had Jaedong, and we actually had a bunch of them that people forget about, Luxury and Yellow Arnak, etc., who obviously sadly were banned due to match fixing. So we had a bunch of good players in the later days, Hydra, etc. But Protoss was the one that always was good and often was in second place for a bunch of time, except towards the latter half of the game, it was definitely in third place. Well, first of all, they had a coin flip matchup for the mirror matchup when PvP that was very, very streaky. There wasn't many players who dominated there. Then they had a massive mismatch when they played Zerg, especially in certain areas, basically like 2005 to 2007 was a really dark period until Bisu came along, and then especially it was only really 2008 where Protoss had its Six Dragons era, the end of 2008, early 2009, where they were very, very good in that sense, and they were able to have some level of dominance where these 6 players rose up and were amazing. So generally, the idea that a Protoss player can win, and the fact that they won traditionally only in these circumstances until kind of you got Bisu and later on Stork and these really, really great players, it's so magical, isn't it? Because this is the most hard done by race, and yet along comes this story, this narrative. It's got to be one of the most magical in the history of esports, that every fall, no matter what's been happening every autumn for people who aren't from America, you can look to the Protoss race and say, right, who's the best Protoss at the moment? Who's got a good chance to do this? They've shifted the maps. Let's see if they can do it again. And what's great about this story is, in a scene which is incredibly competitive, which is in many ways maxed out domestically, in terms of how much you could practice, how much money could be invested, how much infrastructure could be created, how you could practice, the level of the great players. What I loved about Brood Wars, great players stuck around a long time until they were basically completely spent. They didn't just retire after they fell off. And so unlike games like Quake and Counter-Strike, sometimes you never know how the great teams of today would match up against the greats of yesterday. You can at least know how they would have played if they'd kept facing each other later on and hadn't just retired. So what I love about the story of the Legend of the Fall is it's not just magical in terms of the fact it happened, but it gave hope to all the Protoss players. Every time the fall rolled around, now it's our chance. Now we've got a chance to win. And it also plays into the romance of the Protoss race, both in terms of the lore and also in terms of the way that you had to play Protoss in terms of the meta. Because obviously the lore of Protoss, the idea that it's this high culture, very technologically advanced, but also in touch with psionic and intuitive capabilities, and it's about honor, and it's not about being underhanded or just brute forcing opponents or winning just by any means necessary. It kind of actually plays into this aspect, because Protoss as a race was about high skill level, ability to do fantastic micro, could have an incredible impact on Protoss because they have very high damage units and expensive units that can do a lot compared to Terran. Just has to have the right composition traditionally and the right tech path, and then Zerg obviously overwhelms you with very cheap disposable units and therefore macros up very heavily and can just hit you with massive amounts of units. Protoss really is about skill in this sense. It's about intuition. You've got to really walk a tightrope in terms of your build path and your tech tree. You've got to make either clever decisions which deceive your opponent and throw him off and let you go down a tech path that can let you win, or you have to make a perfect read on incomplete information on what he's doing to make sure your tech path counters or responds to what the Terran or Zerg's going to do. Otherwise, you're in a really bad spot. You can't second guess yourself if you're a Protoss. You can't falter in your execution in micro or in this macro aspect. Otherwise, you pretty much outright lose the game. Now, what's great is Protoss units are so powerful and can be so impactful and have so much utility that if you can not second guess yourself and you can go down this tightrope and you don't fall off, you win, you have victory, and it's incredibly exhilarating. So the pressure and the tension and the sheer drama and spectacle of the great Protoss players playing is fantastic in itself, because victory and defeat are always inches apart to your left and to your right, and you must stay the course on this tightrope and perfectly navigate. And if you do, if you can execute in this manner, it's glorious. So there's always been a tension and a drama to the Protoss race, as it were anyway, and the way it was played at the top level competitively in Korea. But then you add in this Legend of the Fall, and seeing which Protoss can at least get to the position to potentially fulfill this is a beautiful storyline in itself. And I do think gave hope to some of the Protosses that otherwise, understandably, might feel very hard done by, because they were. Now, people often mention that one of the reasons why, and it is a key factor as to why Protoss could have the Legend of the Fall, is that Koreans also understand, because they understand mythology and storytelling and narratives, that storytelling is a really great way to market and sell your league. So even though these are esports competitions, they to some degree did rig the map pool each autumn to allow this to potentially happen. Now, they didn't literally rig it right in matches and stuff, but they would try to create, to foment a more Protoss favored map pool towards the autumn to allow Protoss at least a chance, if one of them did very well and went on a hot streak, to fulfill this Legend of the Fall, to keep this really cool narrative for a race which otherwise wasn't going to win many of the OSLs and wasn't going to have the dominant champion that could ever go into 3 straight finals and win, etc. Just wasn't going to happen realistically. So it was a way to have another story that rolls around, and it's an annual story. It repeats again and again. And so First of all, it's not as bad as it sounds when you say you rig the maps there. If you rig the maps for Terran or Zerg, you would be imbalanced as fuck, because those races are already very powerful. If you give them the right map pool, it's going to totally throw off the overall strength of the races. Now, another reason why it doesn't matter as much to mess with the maps for Protoss is because one of the reasons also why Protoss was always at the bottom of the pecking order once Brood War really got going is, okay, so TVZ is where Terran's big advantage comes. And then, in theory, Terran's disadvantage is against Protoss, except by at least the mid-2000s, that had evened out massively. PvT is really a skill matchup. Actually, if the Terran's much better than you, he does win. You don't get that natural advantage in the same way as you do for TVZ and ZVP traditionally. So not only is their strength matchup, PvT, not as strong as the others are relative to the other races, but then they have the mirror matchup that's something of a coin flip, not quite as bad as ZVZ, but not as good as TVT. So to be Zerg or to be Terran was much better in terms of your overall chances against the whole field and your own race, in theory, relative to your strengths elsewhere. So you can see why Protoss had a disadvantage. Now, the reason why that's significant is because when we say they shifted the map pool to favor Protoss, unless you're going to make very gimmicky island maps, which you didn't really have a lot of in Brood War beyond the very early days, because they weren't great television and they were too narrow in terms of the strategic depth possible. Unless you make those types of maps, you can't really make a just Protoss-favored map. Every type of Protoss-favored map, because Protoss exists in this sort of middle ground between the extremes of Zerg and Terran and what they represent and their advantages and style of play, whatever map you shift it towards, you're going to also be giving a little bit of a sideways glance or nod towards either Terran or Zerg. So actually, that's why it didn't happen every season, no matter how good the Protoss were. And that's why it didn't just make it like OP for Protoss and then Zerg and Terran were like, fuck, we can't possibly win. No, so with that in mind, the beautiful element of this narrative is that, for me, Protoss is like this seed where if it could grow to its full strength, if it could survive through the harsh winters and through the heat of the spring and the summer and get to the fall, it would blossom and you'd have this beautiful flower. But you need the compost to get this plant to that point in time. And so the map pool was this compost that potentially these beautiful flowers could grow out of by the light of Protoss higher wisdom and intuition and psionic abilities to these glorious falls, which were not just the fall of the autumn, but thankfully the fall of the tyrannical tyrant-esque Terrans who dominated and won so many of the OSLs, and the Zergs who always had the imbalance against the Protoss and so famously beat them down for so long. It was their fall as well as the fall in itself, and this was Protoss's time to shine. Now, funnily enough, throughout the history of the OSL, and obviously since this only counts for the OSL, not the MSL, you only get one crack at it a year. And I will say, the Koreans, because they love the story so much, fucked with and fudged those numbers big time. Because some of these OSLs, the final doesn't happen sometimes until December. Now, I don't know what Koreans know about the season of autumn or fall, but in December, it's over, mate. That's actually winter. Like, that doesn't count as autumn anymore. But nevertheless, if it just started in the fall, they still counted it as the fall. Sometimes it could start in August and then go through to the fall, and that was fine. So I noticed they did fudge the dates a little bit, but then again, the dates shifted for when that OSL each year would take place. So I guess logically it was the only one that kind of spanned that time. Now, the Legend of the Fall was fulfilled 6 times, and it goes like this. So in 2001, Boxer was the best player in the world. He had won 2 straight OSLs. He was in dominant form. People were anticipating he was the hero of the public. His story had also been the story of Brood War rising as a massive game in Korea and having social penetration on the level of a phenomenon like Pogs or Pokemon or whatever anime. It really had gotten to that kind of height because people were so enraptured by the story of this Boxer guy and this burgeoning esport that people were looking for him to win his 3rd straight OSL, and he would have completed this amazing feat, which no one actually was able to complete until NADA many years later. I think it was actually until like 2006 that NADA was able to first time do it. And obviously later on, by the time you get to NADA, you win a golden mouse if you do that, which later was created for Boxer to have won in his later attempts, but he never fulfilled on it. And so at this moment in time, he not only would have won 3 OSLs, which is the most anyone ever won in history, but he would have won 3 in a row, which no one ever did. So he faced Garimto in the final, And Grimto managed to defeat him, deny Boxer the third OSL title. Funnily enough, Boxer would never get an OSL title. And as you'll soon find out, the story of the Legend of the Fall is actually the story of Boxer failing to get his third OSL in many cases. And here's something that's quite amusing, is that it also, in the latter days of the OSL and Brood War, when Boxer's not relevant anymore, one of his proteges in terms of like SK Telecom Crown Prince, Fantasy, who was supposed to fulfill the line of Boxer and Isle of Uv, and then obviously Fantasy himself, he himself ended up being the victim of the Legend of the Fall on a number of occasions himself. So actually, Boxer and Fantasy, the story of them not winning OSLs is also the story of the Legend of the Fall, funnily enough. So the next time it happened was the next year. It was in 2002. Boxer got back to an OSL final. This time he faced Reach, who obviously was a fantastic macro Protoss, famously was a very ballsy and at times aggressive Protoss player, who as a result didn't sit back and have to pick the perfect tech path, etc. He really took it to the Terrans in that sense, and obviously was willing to macro with the Terrans in a time where people thought you had to be a bit more gimmicky as a Protoss. And heroically, because he was the hero toss, he was able to defeat Boxer, deny Boxer yet again a chance to win the OSL, a third OSL, and the Legend of the Fall 2 straight years. Now, you get to 2003, and funnily enough, no one ever mentions this one, but if technically the Legend of the Fall is just a Protoss winning in the Fall, the one that no one ever mentions is the Protoss player Kingdom, the Devil Toss, who won against Nalra, another Protoss. It was actually guaranteed that a Protoss would win in that final, in the MyCube OSL 2003 final. Now, no one mentions that one. Kingdom was something of a flash in the pan. He just had a hot little streak there. Nara was actually the better player, quite frankly, overall. But again, it's PvP, which is a very weird specialist matchup in some senses. And so, sure, I get it. He's not a truly all-time great player in the same sense as someone like a Reach or a Stork or a Jangbi. But interestingly enough, you got to note that one as a Legend of the Fall entry. Then, the very next year, so 3 straight years, we had... No, that was 3 straight years. Then we skipped 2004. Didn't happen that year. No Protoss won an OSL in the fall of that year. So, because that was when Isle of Uv was in dominant form. So we come to 2005. What do you know? My old mate Boxer's back in the final, his last OSL final, and he's facing Anytime, a Protoss player who was a Hwasong Oz Protoss player, who for this period of time, he made a couple of OSL finals. He was in pretty hot form, but he didn't really deliver on potential to be a truly great player. That was just his best period, and he was a good team league player to some degree, but obviously Hwasong Oz very quickly became Jaedong's team, and Jaedong was eventually the hard carry of that team in many ways. So Anytime beat Boxer in an epic final in the SO1 OSL in 2005, and funnily enough, Anytime actually had a second crack at the Legend of the Fall and could have become the first person in the history of the Legend of the Fall, in fact the only one, to win 2 of these Legend of the Fall OSLs the next year, because in the next year he played against Nada, who at that point in time had been not washed up, but hadn't won for quite a while a big title. He faced him in the Shinhan Bank OSL Season 2 final. Now, this was the one, you may remember, where the storyline, obviously, Anytime didn't complete the Legend of the Fall. He didn't win this one. And it actually became a story about Nada instead, which was the infamous Letter to the Sky, where he wrote that letter on his blog or something about his father who'd been killed tragically, I believe, by a drunk driver, and about how he would get back to the top again and he would win another championship, and to somehow dedicate this to his father. And in doing this, not only did he deliver upon that beautiful story in its own right, but he actually won the Golden Mouse, and he became the first person, eventually there would be 3, Jaedong and Flash would do it as well, to win that Golden Mouse. Very much deserved. You could still make a case now as the greatest Brood War player or StarCraft player or RTS player in history. And so I think kind of fitting that Anytime didn't kind of fluke this OSL or just go on a hot streak, and actually it was a better storyline that played out, but that was a failed attempt at the Legend of the Fall in terms of he made it to the final but didn't deliver on the goods. Then you have skip forward a couple of years to 2008, and Stork, who'd already been denied in an OSL final at this point in time, in fact a couple, in the fall of 2008 wins the Inkruit OSL, where he beats Fantasy, who was still a rookie at the time. I believe I think he was even a Royal Roader for that one actually, and obviously had Isle of Uv helping to coach him. He beat him in the final to win his first OSL, his first big title. Obviously so fitting that a truly great Protoss player like Stork would win in the Legend of the Fall. We want to see the great players fulfilling it, not just players on a hot streak, as happened in many of these years. Funnily enough though, Stork, it's fitting considering he's famous for being in so many finals but not winning many, and is something of a Kong, even though he did win this one title in 2008. He actually also failed twice to deliver on the Legend of the Fall, because he had 2 cracks at it beyond the one that he won. The year before, there was the Ever OSL, where he failed against Jaedong, who he was heavily favoured against, funnily enough, actually. But 2008, he won against an amazing field. He did amazing work winning against other Take Bang Lee Sang members, and then beat Fantasy in the final, won it. And the other time he failed was, again, when he was favoured, is actually he was playing against Fantasy in a rematch in the 2010 Bacchus OSL final, where many thought Stork was going to win this time. He looked in amazing form. He was always an amazing PvT player. But actually, this is the one where his girlfriend left him a week before the final or something. His mentality seemed to be broken. And then Fantasy came with all these weird, gimmicky, cheesy, like elevator strats and weird off-kilter approaches, and just straight up swept Stork and wrecked him out of a final. The worst ever showing for Stork in a grand final. In all the others, he had chances, or he really did have opportunities to win those games. So he failed in 2 out of his 3 opportunities in the Legend of the Fall, but did complete it. And then at the end of the game, we have Jangbi. And Jangbi was a very high skill ceiling Protoss player. Obviously, everyone knows about his storms and about how amazing he was in that sense. He had very good APM as well. But he was someone who hadn't delivered upon that in the individual leagues. He'd been in a bunch of MSL finals. So he finally had gotten to the OSL final for the Fantasy Jin Air, no, for the Jin Air OSL final versus Fantasy rather, in 2011. And in this year, he had that epic one where he was using carriers. I think this was the one I'm thinking of, right? And I think it was a 3-2. And he won and completed the Legacy of the Fall. Admittedly, it was towards the end of Brood War. Like, Brood War died out in like mid-2012. And they were already limiting the number of OSLs at this point in time. Still a pretty cool story, because a great Protoss player had never won his championship, wins it in the OSL, wins it by the Legend of the Fall, wins it against another all-time great Terran player. Very fitting for the storyline and for the narrative as it repeated as a pattern in history. Now, funnily enough, there are only actually 5 years that it didn't happen. So it didn't happen in 2004, 2006, 2007, 2009, or 2010. And of those 5 years, there were actually attempts where a Protoss player was in the final in 4 of the 5 years. So you can see that the map element did help, that having great Protoss players anyway did help, and the fact that they were so horny to win and that they finally got their chances in the fall. It happened as a narrative and a story set up to potentially happen almost every single year, basically. There's only 1 year it really didn't, and there was no attempt whatsoever, which I believe was 2004. So, pretty cool storyline. Now, unfortunately, despite all those great Protoss names I listed off, and the context of them coming up and having their cracks and beating other truly great players, Boxer, Nalra, Fantasy, truly great players we're talking about here. Sadly, 2 of the greatest Protoss players of all time, if you had to pick the 3 greatest Protoss players of all time, I think the most reasonable picks are Bisu number 1, Nalra number 2, but I can certainly hear an argument for Stork number 2. So Nalra or Stork number 2, number 3, right? So we know Stork won, but ironically, when you consider, in contrast to Nalra and Bisu, he didn't win as many championships. He didn't have as much of a winner mentality and to be the number 1 player in the same sense that those guys did, and was considered more of a Kong. He's the only one that completed the Legend of the Fall. Now, Bisu obviously never won an OSL, and in fact, never made the final of an OSL. The closest he came in terms of being able to win an OSL was he came top 4 in some OSLs, one in 2009, one in 2007. And he did have 1 crack at the Legend of the Fall, a really serious one, which was when he ended up finishing 3rd in the Ever 2007 OSL, which was obviously the one where Stork played Jaedong in the final. And first of all, that would have been a Jaedong versus Bisu final, which we never had in one of the OSLs or MSLs. Secondly, it would have been Jaedong versus Bisu because it would have been Stork whose Bisu would have had to have beaten. And even though Stork was being beaten by Bisu at that period of time, he won this crucial semi-final against Bisu in this case to go to that final. And Bisu at the time was in his prime. He could have potentially been a Bonjour at this point in time. He'd won two MSLs. He'd been 3 MSL finals in a row. He was in amazing form. He was very good already, starting to get good at least in the team league. He wasn't quite as good as he was in late years. He wasn't a superstar yet, but he was clearly an amazing player already. And obviously, Bisu is the chosen one. He is the Protoss that was supposed to be able to do everything. Supposed to be able to do more than the other Protoss and could even subvert the disadvantages of the race because, as I said, ZVP was always heavily biased to the Zerg Zergs, well, Bisu is probably the best PvZ player ever, and throughout most of his career, particularly 2007, was godlike in PvZ. In theory, the weak matchup of the Protoss race. So if anyone could have done it, should have been Bisu, right? Unfortunately, first of all, Zergs had more success in the MSL, and that's where Bisu had his major successes. Terran was more about the OSL, quite frankly, and Bisu's PvT always let him down a little bit, and it either let him down when he would play Flash in some of these tournaments, or in this particular instance, obviously playing against Stork in PvP, and this one cost him his shot at the Legend of the Fall. So he actually never was able to accomplish it, and in fact only had one realistic crack at it when you look at his career. Then you look at Nalra, another truly great player, a very inventive player, rightfully called the Boxer of Protoss in that sense, for how he changed the way the race was played. He lost the MyCube OSL final to Kingdom. He actually won the next OSL, but it wasn't the Legend of the Fall anymore. So funnily enough, he's one of the few Protoss that won when there wasn't a Legend of the Fall type scenario. So it shows what a truly great player he was. It wasn't that maps were shifting his advantage, but he never managed to do it otherwise. He never managed to have that amazing run. So interestingly enough, it wasn't that you had to just be the greatest Protoss and you would get the Legend of the Fall. And that kind of shows that it wasn't just map bias that was making these guys win. It was a beautiful story about inspired players who had everything potentially set up so they would have the best chance, and then the one who hit the hot streak and the magical Cinderella run could either have a shot at it or did accomplish it in most of these years.
Machine here, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel. 20-minute video for 2 minutes worth of content. Gold.